So with all that background on, where we've come from in 1.0 marketing automation driven demand engine, when we talk about bringing AI into the mix, let's talk about our approach to building a native agentic demand engine. What does that blueprint look like? The starting point for us at Annuitas and our lens, and we've been at this, for more than a decade, is really 4 key points. We're always looking for our demand engines to be buyer-centric, orchestrating and engaging across the account, across stakeholders, but putting them at the center of the demand process. Building an engine that is optimizable, not a collection of tactics and random acts and quote campaigns. Making sure that we see these buyer journeys in a 360-degree way and that we're bringing the data science, the visualization to bear. And finally, that every interaction, every dollar in the top of the funnel, every point of engagement is quantifiable and we can see what is the key mix so that we can optimize that engine. So this lens is really important as we look at agentic and think about an agentic demand engine because it's the same fundamentals that we've been at now for a decade plus. So what's largely the same in an agentic demand engine from a charter standpoint, right? Number one, we're trying to orchestrate, buying unit, stakeholder engagement for target accounts. That hasn't changed. And we're trying to drive predictable lift to pipelines and revenue. That hasn't changed. But what has changed and what I call some evolved paradigms are a couple of things. Number one, this idea that we're moving to a real two-way demand dialogue, not impressions. And that's a substantial change here. Again, for the longest time, we've had and tried to build an interaction where you nurture and you offer content, you progressively profile to find out more, and you try to make that two-way, but that's not really a dialogue. In an agentic demand engine, we're talking about those agents, those brains, actually driving to a dialogue, chopping up and using content in different ways, sometimes formulating a synthesizing response, sometimes pointing to a content piece. But that's very different than our classic impression. The second piece of it is that there's the true potential for progressive qualification. I will say that none of the platforms are where they need to be yet on this. I think platforms like OneMind and Qualified are certainly coming along and leading out there in terms of their ability to progressively profile and qualify. And I think that we'll get there. But in all of this, we're rapidly moving beyond the static form state and being able to have more of an interrogative interaction with prospects. Next piece of this, and I mentioned earlier, is this idea that, it's not about generating a lead anymore. It's really about creating these stakeholder connects. And by that, I mean substantial moments where it's the right place, right time, and the seller armed with the right information is able to make that connection. We're also starting to look at a variety of different demand signals across channels, across points of interaction, not merely anonymous intent data, and obviously not merely classic form data that was coming in. And then finally, because we're starting to look in this multi-touch state, we're starting to look in this more orchestrated state, we can finally start to have a conversation about an attribution portfolio. So whenever we look at CAC, whenever we look at closed ones, we're not looking at a singular lead source, but we're actually looking at a true multi-touch, not a classic attributed, but like something that actually makes sense and shows all the points of interaction and the inputs. Because really what we're trying to do is optimize that portfolio. So let's translate this to an agentic demand engine. The first thing that I would say is, obviously you could drop in marketing automation here and a lot of these flows would look very similar. So what's so different here, right? One of them is that first and foremost, we're not just talking about a chat agent, we're talking about agentic intermediating your website experience, delivering differentiated experiences for different segments, and actually eventually enabling you to literally prompt browse. I was really impressed. One of the players in the space, OneMind, if you go to their website and engage with Mindy, their agent, when you go to their website, there's no website. like you're just interacting with the agent. The agent is allowing you to prompt browse the information about the company. And so it's a great example of where we're starting to head with that experience. You also obviously see a number of different classic pieces that are out here in terms of fulfillment emails, like that was a marketing automation thing, nurture emails, absolutely. But what's different here is that you're setting the stage for a lot of these emails to be two-way, and that's a big change. And then finally, a couple of other points here. You've got progressive qualification armed with the questions that you want to qualify. We're increasingly starting to enable the agent to then non-linearly build a picture of you, right? And so that's a very different interaction. Last piece in this overall view is this idea that, and I mentioned earlier, we're not generating leads off of this, we're generating connects. And those connects are either direct live chat handoffs. So like if you have a real key account, your enterprise seller is ready to go, they're online, that's showing in Teams and Slack, that their presence is there. We can actually connect to them directly. And that's a big change overall. But if they're not at that point, then we can go in and we can book a meeting and we can brief that prospect. And I think that's a big change as well. And so you see the connect that we're making that's a live interaction. If we overlay some of those evolved paradigms we talked about, we see a number of things that are starting to play out through here. One is this idea of real demand dialogue that is multi-channel, that is two-way, that is across inbound and outbound, that we are not doing lead and funnel management anymore. We're doing progressive qualification. And you see that piece coming in through here, that we're creating those connects, right? Not handing off leads, that we're aggregating all of these demand signals, bringing those into CRM, making those available both for real-time qualification, but also for sellers to be able to see and also to get briefed on and be able to dig further into. And that all of this changes the nature of our reporting and our analysis. And we've been all moving towards this CDP concept for the last couple of years, but Agentic enables CDP to look completely different, to flow in a much more robust CDP view, and to also allow agents to operate inside the CDP cloud to actually improve ETL, to improve the parameters that you've brought into the mix, et cetera. Let's do a little bit of a comparison again back to what's the same, what's evolved when we talk about how we get to agentic demand. A couple of things here. Number one, from a Nudist standpoint, we've always talked about conversation track architecture. And so this idea of understanding your buying stages, having an approach to segmentation, having content segment stage by stage, that hasn't changed as you're planning. And in fact, I want to stress that in an agentic world, your planning is so much more important because that's what we're going to be using to train your agent. So getting this right is really important. But the nature of your conversation track architecture is what's going to change. You're going to see a much more behavioral, ethnographic, less title-based, more behavioral journey, right? Making sure people who have different patterns of needs, different pain points are getting different information. Thinking about your content differently, not making it a bunch of downloadable white papers and webinars, but starting to think about a way for that to be more of a dialogue substrate. Not every answer is going to be a content offer link. So enabling the engine with content a number of different ways. And by the way, I think all of this starts to blur the lines between product marketing, lower funnel content, and demand content marketing, upper funnel content. Second thing is, you would have seen the words lead management or funnel management in here in the past, and we are still, and do care about some funnel stages. We want to be able to manage the process end to end. We absolutely still care about ICP, but there's some fundamental things that are changing. Not lead management anymore, right? Not leads, we're driving to connects. We're going to start to see the process language change, and at Annuitas, we're actually working on some new definitions of what an agentic demand process looks like and how that changes. We're going to see criteria become more dynamic and have the agent be able to address it and pattern it and fill it out in different ways. And that's where criteria could be completed both by dialogue and also by data append. We also see the state where it's not about leads, it's not about accounts, it's about both, right? It's about stakeholders on key accounts and making that change strategically. The last piece of this is that obviously we still care very much about the demand experience. In fact, arguably, the demand experience is more important in an agentic paradigm. We want to see the nature of the interaction, the value back to the buyer, the support and stewardship of their journey to be higher. We want demand experience to go up. So we absolutely want to address all of their stages. We want to blend and bring online and offline, inbound and outbound together. But some things are going to fundamentally change. Like, for example, fundamentally, when you hit the website, whenever you respond to a demand email, it's going to become two-way, which means that it's going to start to become what I call a prompt-based journey. Your prompts, your interrogatives are what's going to actually drive the next piece. And so we're going to start to get to more of a dialogue-based state in nurture and in profiling. We're going to start to expect that we actually are able to get outcomes with sellers sooner, faster. And I think that that's an important piece and will make sellers more productive. The last piece of this is that, and this is, I think, sort of, for me, still mind-blowing, this idea that we're going to think about optimizing our demand experience, not only to be browsed by humans, to be nurtured by humans, but also to be browsed by AI agents, and make sure that those that are looking for solutions can also get the answers they're looking for. So we see these elements coming together: conversation track architecture, agentic qualification model, demand experience, in a demand engine in a very just different way than in the past, where all of this composites to really define a couple things. One, agentic demand use cases, flows, and then ultimately the translation of this is to then training the agent for these use cases, for these flows, for these situations, instead of a static experience, static journey, static qualification, that we're setting the stage for a dynamic model and training to that. We see that when we talk about agentic demand engine development, right? Program development, sort of classic. Again, we've been doing this for 10 plus years. Classic process we go through is blueprinting, implementation, optimization. Couple things are, the same. Couple things have changed, right? We talked about earlier, some of these building blocks are very much still in there. But one of the key things that's changing is that the output of a lot of these phases is in fact training documentation, training logic. And in optimization phases, it's all about improving training. We also see that some of the dynamics of the timelines change. Frankly, a robust demand engine blueprint phase, strategy phase, that's not going to change. And that's actually more important in this model. But we do see that the time to build that is going to go down. We're going to see a faster delivery as we're training, not building so much. But we actually see a lot more time and energy put into optimization phase. And so that long tail of constantly tuning. This is going to really be a substantial change and represent substantial change management for marketing, for demand, for field marketing professionals. They're very much used to driving activities and certainly, intaking on how they perform. But this idea of less executional, more optimizational is really a change in terms of the cadence of how they do a lot of their work.